Okay, today to start off this module, we're going to talk about the general enlightenment of the 1700s, the philosophical and political movements that will result from it that will eventually lead to a couple of major revolutions that we'll talk about in a fair amount of detail for at least a little while. The American Revolution and the French Revolution, and how they'll have a major impact on Spain. And this is really important stuff to go over before we get to the revolutions in Latin America, because these revolutions, especially the French Revolution, will destabilize European politics so much that will create an opportunity for the Latin Americans to rise up in their own revolutions a couple decades later. So it's really important to understand the kind of philosophical background that will eventually lead to these revolutions and set the stage for revolutions in many other parts of the world. So the first section is going to just talk about the general Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was a general kind of philosophical movement coming out of the 1600s, when Europe underwent a different type of movement, intellectual movement called the Scientific Revolution. And that Scientific Revolution was largely focused on finding what the researchers and scientists called the natural laws that drive kind of natural phenomena. So the natural laws they were trying to find through their research were trying to figure out what causes hurricanes, or what causes a flood, or what causes an eclipse. Like, what are the core events that are happening that lead to those results that humans experience and observe. So the scientific revolution of the 1600s is largely based on mathematics and astronomy and human anatomy, how the body works, and it's mostly based in what we would today call the hard sciences, like physics and whatnot. So there's a lot of kind of scientific discoveries and a lot of scientific experiments in the 1600s trying to figure out what are the natural laws that determine things like gravity, or why the Earth rotates around the sun, or something like this. So that kind of research started to really explode in Europe, at least amongst the intellectual class, as there's a lot of these mathematical and scientific discoveries. So the 1600s in Europe is often known as the scientific revolution because of those discoveries. And by the late 1600s, other philosophers will take up that idea of natural laws, and they'll start to apply it to other things outside of the hard sciences. And that's where the Enlightenment will start to rise, because the new philosophers will take that idea of natural laws and they'll apply it to all kinds of human experiences and human decision making. So you'll get some of these philosophers will start to study how do governments make certain decisions about taxation. And so you'll get economics as a discipline will rise out of that as a social science. A lot of other philosophers will study how do people make decisions according to morality or immorality. Why do they make certain other types of anti-moral decisions? So you'll get psychology and philosophy starting to rise as kind of disciplines, again, trying to study what are the natural laws of human decision making that lead to all these kind of psychological results. And we also get the rise of the study of history, basically. What are the kind of natural laws that governments follow when they make decisions to go to war, or pass a certain law, or try to assassinate a foreign leader or something like this. So you'll get historians getting involved with this idea of natural laws, also trying to find that core thing, that core defining phenomenon that will drive decision making and lead to kind of worldwide results. Another thing about the Enlightenment is this focus on the word reason. So if you ever study the Enlightenment, you'll see this word used over and over in all these philosophical books and journal articles and encyclopedia articles. So reason is the big catchphrase of the Enlightenment by the 1700s. So, what is reason? Reason is defined not as what we think of the word today as like your reason for doing something, like your purpose or your justification. Reason back then was seen as kind of logic. If you had a lot of reason, you had a lot of critical thinking skills or logical thought. So reason is seen as kind of the method for enlightenment. Reason is your pursuit of logic. You ask a research question and you kind of study some data and you come up with a proposal for an answer. They call that a logical progress, a kind of scientific method. So the method itself is logical. So they are going to use reason to come to higher levels of understanding about the world and humanity. But reason is also the goal of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment philosophers want to use reason, use logical thought and study and research, not just as a method to gain some type of knowledge, but they say that the more you use logical thought and the more you use this research, that will build up your logical understanding of the world around you, which will lead you to more logical pursuits. And it goes higher and higher and higher as you build up not just reason as a method to get there, but reason is the goal. You become more reasonable, more logical in the world. So the Enlightenment is very optimistic that they have discovered these kind of secrets of research and learning that, if just pursued rationally, pursued logically, will build up human knowledge to the point where humans can really solve every major problem that they confront in the world. They can solve famine, they can solve floods, they can solve political crises, they can solve people's psychological problems. So the Enlightenment is extremely optimistic for the future of humanity. But the Enlightenment also it runs as a kind of methodical, mechanical way because it comes out of the scientific revolution. So a lot of these philosophers think of what we today call a scientific method, where you see a problem, you pose a hypothesis about what's causing the problem, and then you do a bunch of research and build up a bunch of data, and you analyze the data, and you kind of compare the data to your hypothesis. And if your hypothesis, if your idea doesn't fit the data that you've accumulated, then you have to change your mind. That's what we call the scientific method. So it's a kind of mechanical, logical system. And to the Enlightenment, they say as long as you pursue that scientific method in research and in learning, you will build up higher levels of reason, higher levels of understanding and rationality. And the Enlightenment kind of started off with this hope that, of course, the educated elite will do this at first because they're the ones who know how to read and write. They're the kind of scientists that'll get this thing started. But they also have a great hope that education systems can be built to teach the average people to read and write so that they can get involved in these debates also. So the Enlightenment, one of its big processes or one of its big goals is to convince government to build public education systems so that virtually everybody in the society can be taught to learn and read and write on at least an elementary level, so that they can also read these articles and encyclopedia entries and whatnot, and they can understand the world around them. So the Enlightenment is very optimistic that they don't just, the Enlightenment kind of high-level intellectuals, they don't just want to do this research to benefit themselves. They want to give the research away for free for the whole rest of the world to learn from. And they say if you educate others, and everyone who has education has the freedom to participate in this kind of large conversation about how the world works and how to fix our problems, then they say that human progress is infinite. Over the generations, people will acquire higher and higher and higher levels of understanding, to the point where some Enlightenment philosophers talked about the perfectibility of man, that humans will be able to solve all the problems they confront if they just research the problem logically through the scientific method. So again, the Enlightenment is extremely optimistic that all problems are solvable if you just go about finding the solution in a reasonable way. So that's the kind of general approach to enlightenment that a lot of these philosophers are taking in the 1700s. And we have to remember that a lot of these philosophers are outside of government. They are not leading governments. They are not advising the leaders of governments usually. The Enlightenment leaders and the scientists, they are usually people from fairly wealthy families that had enough money so they could go to universities and study these high-level ideas. And they largely do their own research either as an employee of a university, as a professor, a faculty member, or if their family has enough money, they can just have a nice house somewhere and they do their own research and pay for it themselves. So they don't need to have jobs because they're rich enough. So they participate and push the Enlightenment forward just to their own private means. So there's a lot of research going on in all kinds of different fields in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment studies psychology. It starts the kind of movement toward economics, sociology. So a lot of the social sciences that we identify today all come out of the Enlightenment or start in the Enlightenment. And we still have the scientific revolution going at the same time. So the mathematicians and astronomers and physicists, they're all doing their thing also in the 1700s. So this is a major time for human learning in Europe. And this is really where Europe kind of catches up to the rest of the world and emerges out of its own dark ages, the medieval period, to kind of philosophically and intellectually and scientifically catch up with the other kind of leaders of the world in those realms, coming out of the Ottoman Empire, what we today call the Middle East, or China. So the rest of the talk that we're going to have with the Enlightenment is really going to be on political philosophy, because some of these Enlightenment philosophers get into thinking about where do governments come from, and what kind of governments are good, what kind of governments are bad, and how should people create good governments and make sure that they have good government. And those are the kind of philosophical arguments that will eventually directly lead to the big revolutions in the late 1700s. So we'll just go through some of the three of the biggest and most important books for political philosophy coming out of the Enlightenment. One of the big early ones is from a guy named John Locke, who was one of the major Enlightenment figures who studied all kinds of different topics like morality and education and things like this. But he also wrote a couple big books on government in the late 1600s. So Locke's most famous book, his most important book for the revolutions, is called the Second Treatise, the second pamphlet basically on civil government. So it's a fairly short book, and he lays out some very, very important ideas that others will take up and push forward later. The first big idea is what Locke called the state of nature. And this is Locke's description of human lifestyles before there was government. So he said before there was any government, people can really run around and do whatever they want, because there's no government passing laws that would make things illegal for them to do. So Locke says that the state of nature is really just kind of anarchy. It's chaos. People who have the freedom to do literally whatever they want because there's no laws to stop them and there's no government or no police force to stop them. He says that most people might be pretty decent people. They might just kind of enjoy their freedoms and do what they want. But he says the real problem is the minority of the people that are a bunch of really greedy and vicious people that, given the freedom to do so, they will go out and steal and kill and intimidate others and rape and pillage and plunder and do whatever they can to make themselves rich. And he says that those people are really a giant threat to the whole rest of human society. So Locke said that having all these perfect freedoms in the state of nature to do whatever you want may sound good kind of theoretically, but in reality it could become a really horrible place, because the people who tend to accumulate power and push others around are usually the most vicious, the least trustworthy, So in the state of nature, most people are really scared because they're afraid of being attacked at any moment. People are afraid to sleep because they're afraid that their neighbors or someone are going to break into their home and not just steal whatever you have, but just might massacre your whole family to get your goods, your stuff out of your house. So Locke says that the state of nature is a very scary place for most people, because any day can be your last because you don't know when you're going to be attacked. So Locke describes the state of nature for humans as basically being like really a bunch of animals. It's everyone out for themselves, and whoever is strongest or fastest or most conniving and cutthroat, those are the ones that are going to survive. So he says this does very bad things for humanity, basically. So Locke's solution, his explanation, is that people generally get sick of being afraid all the time. So people started at some point to come together and made a deal on a probably small community level to create some kind of political government to create laws and punish the people who would break those laws. But in doing so, those people have to give up some of their freedom, some of their power. Namely, they agree to give up the freedom to attack and kill whoever they want whenever they want. So that's the basic deal that Locke describes. People come together in a community and they agree amongst themselves that this perfect absolute freedom is not doing good things for most of society. So a good deal is for people to give up those extreme freedoms, those freedoms to harm other people, basically. They give those up to the kind of common, and they give the power to a government to write laws. So they're going to create what becomes known as a legislature, a group that will write laws that the community will approve. So usually they'll write laws that make murder illegal, that make rape and theft and extortion and all these bad things illegal. And then they'll create some type of law enforcement body. So some type of law executor, a group or a power of the government that will execute the laws, that will enforce the laws, and punish the lawbreakers. So Locke is describing this in pretty vague terms. I mean, he doesn't have a lot of historical evidence for exactly when and where this happened and what the first government was or anything like that. But it's a general philosophical statement that this is probably how the first government started to rise, just out of the problem of anarchy. But when you create a government, Locke also recognized that that could create a whole nother problem. And namely, what happens when the government gets out of hand and the people running the government become more interested in keeping their own power than they are interested in enforcing the law for the kind of equality and benefit of everybody. So Locke says the next step is that when the government gets so out of hand, when the legislature, the lawmakers, or the executive, the law enforcers, act, quote, against their trust, against the public, the government's purpose is to enforce equality and stop people from harming each other. But if the government is becoming a threat to the people by becoming a kind of tyranny, where the government leaders kind of enforce really brutal laws against the people just so the leaders can stay in power, Locke says that that's not a good thing. That's when the government has broken the deal, because the government's supposed to protect people's lives and equality and property. But when the government gets out of hand, they have act against their trust. And the government itself is becoming a threat to the people. Locke wrote that at that time, the people have the right to revolt against the government because they're the ones who built the government in the first place. It's their government. And if the people don't like what the government is doing, the people have the right to basically trash can that government system, get rid of that, and build up a new government to do the job again, to protect people's lives and equality and property. So Locke has a general theory of where governments came from, why they started to happen, and a general theory of that becomes known as the right to revolution. The people have the right to revolt against their government because they're the ones who created it. It's like it's their property. And if they don't like what the government is doing, they have the right to get rid of it and replace it with something new. And Locke wrote that this obviously relies heavily on the public paying attention to what the government's doing. They don't want to let the government just start getting away with things in secret. And that the people have to be fairly educated about what the government's doing. They have to watch the government pretty closely. And the people have to be able to honestly, openly debate and talk about what their government is doing. Because if they can't even talk about it, then the government is probably a tyranny. So that's the general theory coming from Locke about where governments came from and whatnot. And this is a hugely influential theory. So later philosophers in the Enlightenment will largely agree with Locke's philosophy about where government came from and the right to revolution. So another one of the big Enlightenment writers several decades later, named Rousseau, he's largely in France, writes another book called The Social Contract. That basically agrees with Locke's kind of original formula. Rousseau calls it the social compact, but again, it's the same idea. It's that the individuals come together and they give up a little bit of their natural liberties, their rights, to the common so that a government can be built to uphold all the rights of everybody equally. And Rousseau and Locke, they both emphasize very heavily that when people come together to build that government and give up some of their liberties, that the people should really give up as few of their freedoms to the government as possible to build that government. So, logically, the people give up the right to murder each other and steal from each other and all that. But the government shouldn't kind of take too many rights from the people, because if the government does that, then it becomes a tyranny. Rousseau, though, did not really trust a lot of governments because by the late 1700s, the government, especially in France, he didn't like. He accused the French king of becoming a tyrant and trying to oppress all the people just to stay in power. So Rousseau is much more concerned about how the people should rise up against their government, or what are the signs that the government's getting out of hand and whatnot. So Rousseau adds on that the people are always sovereign. And sovereignty means like basically the power. People always have the power to determine what the government is and how it functions. The people, when they build the government, they don't give up their power because they never can. So Rousseau argues that the people are always sovereign. They must be always sovereign. They can never give up their power. They can never sell their power. They can never have their power taken away from them over the government. The people own the government. It's their property. So over many, many generations, if a government continues existing, the government leaders may start calling themselves king, and they'll create a lot of traditions to make themselves look so special and different from everybody else. But Rousseau really hated those ideas because it tends to say that the king is sovereign instead of the people. And Rousseau said, no, the sovereign can never be taken from the people. The people are always sovereign forever. Their sovereignty cannot be alienated, cannot be separated from them. And the people's sovereignty cannot be represented. So Rousseau also deeply distrusted representative government. Governments that hold elections every once in a while where people can vote for the representatives to go to the capital city and pass laws for them. Rousseau did not trust politicians because he says once they get to the capital city, they're going to start conspiring to keep power for themselves. So he said that a representative government is usually a government of the elite, and that just every once in a while there's an election where the people just vote whether or not to accept what the government's been doing. And Rousseau was very against that idea. He wanted the people to always believe in their sovereignty and use their sovereignty. So Rousseau will also in that book create several more kind of extreme interpretations of how sovereign the people are and how people should pass their own laws instead of having representatives do it for them. Another big book that comes out just a few years after the social contract, about 15 years later, is called The Wealth of Nations. And this is a big book on economics by a guy named Adam Smith in Scotland. So the Wealth of Nations talks a lot about a lot of different things in economics. Talks about basically capitalism and industrialization and predicts a lot of those powers. But in the beginning of the book, Adam Smith laid out this giant argument against mercantilism, which is the general kind of economic strategy that governments were using in that time to enrich themselves. So Adam Smith really hated mercantilism because he said it was inefficient. He said it was bad for the economy. And for one big reason is that it restricts economic competition. Mercantilism tends to sell monopolies to individual companies to sell certain goods in a market. And whenever you have a monopoly, by default, it restricts competition. It stops other competing companies from rising up to sell those same goods in those same markets. And he says whenever you have a monopoly, you will see prices of goods rise, which hurt the average people in society because a lot of times they can't afford to buy those products anymore. And a monopolistic company, they'll jack up their prices in order to make more money, and they're also going to make pretty bad products because if you need one of those products, you don't have any alternative to buy it from. So if you need a shovel and there's only one shovel company around, you have to buy a shovel from that company. No matter how crappy that shovel is, and no matter what the cost is, you have to figure out a way to buy it. Because there's no other companies out there as alternative shovel companies for you to go and get a better shovel from. That's it. There's only one company. So he said that mercantilism and monopolies restrict competition in markets, which tends to hurt the average people and hurt innovation because no better shovels are going to be made if there's only one company that's making all the money, because why would they be inspired to try to build anything new? They're making all the money they possibly can with the crappy shovels they're already selling. Another way is that mercantilism tends to restrict the labor market. It tends to stop workers from moving around very much. So they can't go from one place to another. And a lot of the laborers will try to basically monopolize the workforce for a certain industry in their area. So they'll also restrict the amount of new workers coming in because they want to control the labor supply. So he says that hurts a lot of innovation, and it's basically a monopolization amongst the workers. And Adam Smith generally hated monopolies because he said that they're basically leeches on society. He said a monopolistic company and its owners, they not only harm the average people by jacking up their prices at market and selling bad products and not innovating any really good new products, but because those monopoly owners are the only ones selling that product in a given market, they make huge amounts of money. They become super rich. And they use their money to bribe government officials to convince those government leaders to allow them to continue having a monopoly. So the monopoly owners take a small percentage of their massive profits and they basically reinvest it in bribing the government to continue to allow them making those massive profits year after year. So Adam Smith's great quote is that monopoly owners exert, quote, a disproportionate influence on government policy, which means that they own the government to a large extent, and the government will respond to the monopolist demands because of bribery, straight out bribery. That's it. And even in countries that have a democracy where you have elections and these government leaders have to run for re-election, they'll go for what we today call campaign donations from the monopoly owners because those monopolistic companies are the ones that have all the money. So these companies tend to own politicians and they tend to tell politicians what to do. And the politicians who don't follow orders are often kicked out of office pretty quickly. So Adam Smith hated monopolies and hated monopolistic companies because they tend to control government, even in a democracy. And another way he hated all this, he said that mercantilism and monopolies, they tend to control their governments, and monopolistic companies, they want access to foreign markets. So they want access to foreign resources around the world, and they want access to large populations around the world to sell their products. And that tends to lead to foreign wars as the government goes out and sends its military out to conquer and colonize those places that they deem valuable. And because each of the different kind of major countries in the world, the major powers, they generally all recognize where the valuable areas are, so they all want to colonize the same areas around the globe, and that leads to foreign wars. And Adam Smith says, who pays for those wars? It's usually not the monopoly owners, because they'll tell the government to go and tax somebody else, and the government will. So the average workers in the society, they're the ones who pay the high taxes to keep all this system running. And they're the ones that are going to get drafted into the armies to go out and fight the wars. So Adam Smith said that this is hugely destructive of the average population. They pay high prices at market to buy monopolized goods. Monopoly owners can control government to the point where the tax rates hit the average people the most, and they're the ones who are going to go out and fight the wars to keep this system going. So Adam Smith said that mercantilism is a hugely corrupt and bad system for humanity. And a lot of these complaints will also reach into the revolutions that we'll see rise in the later 1700s, and even in the Latin American revolutions that we'll see break out toward the end of this module. So those are some of the major Enlightenment texts on kind of politics and government and economics. And those will start to have a pretty large effect. One interesting thing is that they didn't really have much of an effect in the Latin American colonies. It seems that a lot of these Enlightenment books and articles and kind of pamphlets and whatnot, they do make their way into the Latin American colonies, mostly through clergy and government bureaucrats that are educated enough to be able to read this stuff, and they have some money to buy the books and whatnot. But the elites, they kind of read these books. They don't seem to really debate it much, at least not out in the public, not out in society. Maybe they kind of debate it amongst their own private parties and houses or something like that, or their own get-togethers. But not really so much in public settings. So the Enlightenment doesn't really have a whole lot of an effect on the Latin American elite, or even in the average people who are complaining, as we've talked about before, about government reforms and government inefficiencies. So these massive statements about what government should be and people have the right to revolt against bad government, that doesn't really reach the Latin Americans very much, because the revolt ideas in Latin America aren't really revolutionary to get rid of the whole government. They're more kind of demanding government reforms to make their tax collection better or make their trade more efficient. So perhaps many historians argue that perhaps most of the common people in Latin America hear about these scientific and Enlightenment texts and these ideas through sermons, through possibly illegal pamphlets that are floating around, kind of contraband books basically, sometimes through public graffiti, just kind of writing on public walls, and sometimes through just kind of informal discussions, floating around in the colonies in bars or coffee houses or something like this. So there is a kind of undercurrent of Enlightenment thought spreading through the colonies, but it doesn't seem to have a gigantic effect. So this undercurrent, there is some ideas floating around, and those ideas are very critical of imperial economic systems that the Spanish or the Portuguese government system that they've set up in the colonies. So some of the colonists will become very critical of the monopolies and the tax privileges and the trading restrictions that the Spanish and Portuguese governments have set up, and they'll accuse those governments of kind of using those systems to harm colonial progress and development. There are some intellectual clubs that get going in some of the major cities out in Latin America that will kind of read these books and question them and question what the government's doing. But again, they're usually in kind of private settings and they don't really explode into the public until much later. So one thing that's kind of important in the around 1759, 1760 is the Portuguese government's decision to kick out all the Jesuits from the Portuguese Empire. We talked about this previously. And that had a big effect on the Enlightenment spread in Brazil, because suddenly with the Jesuits being kicked out of the country, they had been running the education system, especially the colleges in Brazil. So with the Jesuits kicked out and the government now running the colleges, the government now has to hire a whole bunch of new professors to go into the colleges, and they largely hire professors who had just gotten out of college themselves and had studied a lot of these Enlightenment ideas and were very excited by it. So these new professors go into a lot of Brazilian colleges to replace the Jesuits, and they start bringing Enlightenment ideas into the colleges and teaching them. So the expulsion of Jesuits may have actually spread up the spread of Enlightenment ideas in Brazil and possibly in other areas of Latin America. But probably in Brazil, the Enlightenment's kind of biggest effect is more to encourage kind of study of the natural environment according to the scientific revolution. The Enlightenment political ideas that we've been talking about did not inspire open revolt or revolution in Brazil. And many historians have argued that that's largely because of the kind of class system, the economic class system that was very solidly in place in Brazil by the mid to late 1700s. So that meant that in Brazil, only the richest people were highly educated, because they're the only ones who could afford to hire tutors or pay tuition to go into colleges to educate either themselves or their family members. And we also have to remember that a lot of these, the upper class in Brazil are plantation owners that are growing sugar or cotton or tobacco, and they depend very heavily on slave labor. And therefore they understand that they are at the top of a social hierarchy. And that may have kind of moderated their reception of Enlightenment ideas, because they may read about the Enlightenment call for equality or better government or more freedom or something like that. But a lot of the Brazilian elite may be very resistant to those ideas and worried about them, because once you start to spread the idea of equality, then the natural, logical result of that is to get rid of slavery. And of course, these big landowners don't want to do that because they're making so much money off of slavery. So many historians argue that especially in Brazil, these Enlightenment ideas kind of get moderated, they get kind of watered down, because the Brazilian elites might want to talk about government reform to make it more efficient, to make trade efficient or tax collection efficient, but they do not want to talk about outright revolution because they're afraid of where that might lead. All right, and now we're going to get into kind of the real-world political results of a lot of these Enlightenment theories. And really one of the first big attempts at revolution according to these Enlightenment theories is in what becomes the United States, what a lot of textbooks call the American Revolution. And this revolution started off in the 13 colonies, the 13 British colonies in North America. And it starts off as a direct result of that giant war that ended in 1763. Basically, the British government was really in debt because they had to borrow money to win the war. And they figure after the war is over in 63 that they're going to start raising tax rates to pay down their debt, to get more government revenue to pay off the national debt. So they start raising taxes in their colonies and in Britain itself. And these tax increases anger a lot of portions of the population in the 13 colonies, and that starts off a type of rebellious type movement where people complain about the taxes, and then the government sends in more troops to enforce the taxes, which angers the people even more because now they're afraid that the government is arresting people and starting to tyrannize over the colonies. So that's the general debate from 1763 going into the mid 1770s, when actual fighting breaks out between some colonial militias, some volunteer soldiers basically, that start to define the British Army as not really helping them and defending them, but kind of controlling them and oppressing them instead. So a revolutionary war breaks out amongst the kind of most extreme radicals in the colonies versus the British Army. And that fighting starts in 1775. And this map you see here is a map of the big invasion points of the British Army where they feel that they can invade these different colonies to defeat the revolutionaries. But the big thing for all this talk about politics that comes out of the American Revolution is a document called the Declaration of Independence. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It's the colonists declaring independence, saying that we want to become independent countries now. And the Declaration is a statement to the world of this is why we want to become independent countries. And it really goes according to a lot of these Enlightenment philosophers' ideas about where government came from and what the people's relation to that government should be. So the most famous paragraph in the Declaration says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator, some type of God or something, with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So what does all that mean? It's basically really quoting Locke and Rousseau and these other philosophers and their whole theory about where governments came from, that God created everybody equally, or the Creator, whatever that is, creates all people equally, and that they have certain rights that this document calls unalienable rights, rights that cannot be separated from a person. It's rights that the people retain just because they're a living, breathing person. So the rights of life, that you have the right to live, you should be allowed to live without being assaulted or killed, that you have the right to liberty, that you should not be oppressed, or the government should not jail you without kind of formal charges, and pursuit of happiness, that's kind of vague. But the idea of unalienable rights is a giant philosophical statement to justify revolution. They're basically arguing that the British Army is coming in and stealing people's rights. They're killing some of the colonists, so stealing their right to life, and they're jailing others without any charges at all, without ever being found guilty of anything. So they're stealing the people's right to liberty also. And the next sentence says that in order to secure and keep these natural rights, the people come together and they create governments. And that's the exact same theory as Locke and others, that people came together in the state of nature to create government, to pass laws, to protect themselves and protect each other equally, so that everyone could follow the law equally and they won't have to worry about being attacked all the time. So that's why these people came together, to create government. And the problem, though, for the colonies, though, these 13 colonies, is that this form of government has become destructive of those purposes. So whenever that happens, the people have the right to alter or abolish a government that is acting against its trust and is not protecting the people's rights, but instead is oppressing the people's rights. So this is basically calling on Locke's theory that this is why the American colonists are revolting against Britain, and they want their own countries, because Britain has been acting as a tyranny and is oppressing the people's rights. And of course, if the people have the right to get rid of an old government because it's not doing its job, it's not protecting the people, people's next step is to create a new government that will instead guard their safety and happiness and their ability to follow the law. So this is the big statements coming out of the American Revolution. And again, the American Revolution is a revolution of 13 different colonies, 13 different independent governments, who formed an alliance in order to fight and win the war against Britain. But after the war was over, those 13 different colonies, now states, became 13 different governments again. So they may try to cooperate, but in the end, they're basically 13 different little countries. So they each have their own governor, they each have their own laws, they each have their own constitutions, they each have their own money. So the 13 only came together to fight and win the War of Independence against Britain to guarantee their independence. And one thing that a lot of historians will argue is that Latin Americans will later look at that example and say, yeah, we have a lot of different colonies, a lot of different viceroyalties here, that maybe we should kind of cooperate in overthrowing the Spanish tyranny or the Portuguese tyranny into the future, but maybe we'll kind of revert back into independent country status after the war is over. And another thing that a lot of Latin Americans learned from the American Revolution is that the American Revolution depended very heavily on European rivalries to succeed. So the American revolutionaries will rise up against the British, but they will also invite the French army to help them, because the French and British have been rivals for centuries, and the French are very happy to do so. Another big problem that historians point out, and a lot of Latin Americans point out, is that the founding ideas of the United States they always talk about liberty, equality, democracy. So those are the ideas in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the other founding documents. But the problem is that once the country actually starts to function, the new United States government starts to behave like just any other European imperialist country. So the United States will continue to allow slavery. They will use genocide against Native Americans to gain more land. The U.S. government will be absolutely obsessed with gaining more territory. For its first 80 years or so, they're going to go off and conquer a large chunk of the North American continent, and then they're going to get into industrialization, the building of factories. So the United States government may talk about these Enlightenment ideas of liberty and equality and unalienable rights and whatnot, but in the real world, when they start making decisions about how their government functions and what its goals are, it starts looking like just any other oppressive force in the world. And all this leads us into the French Revolution that will start just a few years after the American Revolution succeeded and built up its own government. So the French Revolution starts, interestingly, in almost the exact same year that the U.S. Constitution is written, 1788, 1789. And the details of why the French Revolution happened, historians have written many, many books on that, so there's a long list of arguments. But generally, they all agree on the French government was going broke. It had too big of a national debt. Its tax collection was too inefficient. Its rich people were avoiding taxes almost completely, so really the poor were paying most of the taxes, and it just wasn't enough money to keep the government running. So the French king called an ancient body called the Estates General to meet in May 1789 to advise the king to reform the tax code, basically, and reform the government to really get the government back on its feet. And the Estates General is made up of 3 different estates. The first estate are the representatives of the Catholic Church. So the Catholic clergy are one of the groups that are going to show up to advise the king. The second estate are the major landowners, so the big rich elite. So they are the second estate that's going to advise the king. And the third estate is literally everybody else in the country. So the first 2 estates, they get to just kind of choose their own kind of leaders to go to the big meeting in May. So the clergy chooses a couple hundred of its own members to go to talk with the king in May. Virtually all the big landowners, if you have a noble title, if you're a lord or a duke or a count or something, you get to go, or one representative of your family gets to go to the meeting. But the third estate, everybody else, they have to have elections throughout France in local areas to determine who from their community will go to the meeting to kind of advise the king and the other estates or negotiate with them. So the Estates General starts in May, and the leaders of the third estate start getting very angry because they say that they have more people at the meeting. They have over half of the people that are there for the meeting, or they come from the third estate. But the king says that he's really only going to listen to the first 2 estates. So the third estate is going to be kind of left out in the cold. And the third estate gets really pissed off about that. And they start to argue that since they were elected by the general population, and that general population does all the useful work in society, they grow all the food, they're the ones that do all the labor, basically, that the third estate will argue that they are the legislature of the country. They are elected by the people who do all the work. So the third estate will try to take power, and they eventually will. And they will start to write a constitution later that summer in August of '89. And that constitution will eventually do some pretty radical things for the French government. Number one, it cuts the king down to size and merely makes the king into the executive branch of what they call a constitutional monarchy. So they're writing a constitution that's going to give specific powers to the different branches of government, and the king is reduced to merely being the executive branch. So instead of a president or a governor, the king will be responsible for enforcing the laws. And the legislature will pass the laws. They will write the laws. So this is a very different thing where, before in France, the king could make the laws himself. The next big thing that the Constitution will do is create a difference between active citizens who get to vote and who become legislators and pass laws, and passive citizens who don't even get to vote in elections at all, and they merely follow the laws. A third thing that the Constitution will do is just abolish feudalism. So that whole social, economic, and political system in France one day is just gone when the legislature just votes it out of existence one night on August 4th. They just take a vote in the middle of the night, and suddenly there is no more feudalism in France. So that was a gigantic change. The Constitution will also remove all nobility. So these landowners might keep their land because they have property. I mean, they've bought the land and whatnot. They've paid for it. So they're still landowners, but they do not have an official title. They're not called dukes or counts or lords or anything like that anymore. Those titles are gone. And because the titles are gone, their tax exemptions are gone. So these landowners are going to have to start paying taxes on the scale of really everyone else in society. And that really angers a lot of the nobility and the landowners because they don't want to pay taxes and they want their privileges back. The Constitution will also basically get rid of the Catholic Church. So Catholicism is basically wiped out by law in revolutionary France. And the lands around the church, the church has the property that the church sits on, but also owns farmland kind of around the church. So a lot of that land is nationalized, which means the government takes over that farmland and they sell it at auction. And any tithes, local taxes on the common people, usually in sales taxes, to fund the local Catholic Church, all those taxes are abolished. Those taxes that directly funded the church's operation in their locality. So the church is going to have to figure out how to survive on its own economically without all those privileges and income streams. And the introduction to the Constitution will basically give the general Enlightenment political theory of equal rights and universal equality and whatnot. And eventually, the French Revolution will follow through after a couple more years, and they will abolish slavery. So they will become the first major European power to make slavery illegal in France and illegal in the rest of their worldwide empire. So the big groups who really hate all these reforms and hate the Constitution, number one, the king, because he doesn't like his power kind of cut down. The Catholic Church hates the whole Constitution because they're losing a lot of power and wealth. But the biggest group that hates it are actually the landowners. And they hate the Constitution, and when they start to say so publicly, the public will often gather outside their homes and threaten them. So a lot of the landowners become very, very afraid of just being killed by these kind of rabidly revolutionary people out there in society. So a lot of these landowners decide to emigrate. They decide to leave France and go somewhere else because they see basically the writing on the wall that this could become very dangerous for them and their family. So a lot of them leave France and they become known as les émigrés, which are basically immigrants, people who leave their home place and go to another place. And a lot of les émigrés did not go very far. They go just on the other side of the French border, up into the kind of northeastern border area, and they go and sit in the Netherlands or Belgium or one of these Germanish areas just on the other side of the French border. So they're technically in a foreign land in order to escape the French Revolution, and because they felt so threatened by it. The French revolutionary government really hates this. They don't mind that the wealthy elite are leaving France, but the revolutionary government worries that the fact that they're sitting right there on the border means that they might be conspiring to raise big armies and in order to invade France to kill off the revolution. So the revolutionary leaders start to get very paranoid that les émigrés, the émigrés, are conspiring with foreign governments, and powerful foreign governments like Britain or Prussia or Austria, to raise armies and invade France and destroy the revolution. So in order to stop that, the French government declares war on Austria in spring of 1792, and then on Prussia. And those are the two of the biggest military powers in Europe at the time. And as all this starts to happen, the French king starts to complain, and the government actually imprisons the king, and then they put him on trial for treason, and they execute him in public in January 1793. So this is a painting of the king has just had his head cut off, and you see the guy on the right standing on the stage holding something up, and that's the king's head, showing it to all the people that are gathered to cheer the king's murder. And this really outrages a lot of monarchs throughout the rest of Europe who saw the French king as a victim. And a lot of royalists and monarchists all over Europe, they now hate the French Revolution for having killed the king. They say this is basically a crime. And those governments will start to form an alliance that becomes known as the First Coalition. So the biggest, most powerful governments in Europe at the time Britain, the Dutch Republic, Spain, they all get involved in this war with Prussia and Austria. They form this gigantic alliance to all basically try to attack France from all sides at the same time. And Spain gets involved in this because of a Spanish advisor to the king named Godoy, who really declared, joined the idea that the French Revolution's murder of their own king was a giant crime, and Godoy, the prime minister, pushes Spain to form an alliance with the First Coalition to invade and defeat the French Revolution. The problem, though, for Godoy and others is that they cannot defeat the French Revolution. The French popular armies come out to fight against professional soldiers, and they actually win, and they win big. So the First Coalition is defeated by the end of the summer in 1794. And this has gigantic results for Spain. France wins the war, and really forces Spain into a peace treaty in 1795. Spain lost its battles pretty badly. And basically, France forced Spain to sign this treaty even while the rest of the First Coalition is still trying to fight it out. So Spain kind of gives up on the First Coalition before anybody else and signs this treaty in 1795 and gives up a lot of land to France. Number one, Spain gave up all of the Louisiana Territory back to France. And number two, gave the eastern half of Hispaniola, this map on the right, the major island in the middle, the first place that Spain had colonized in the New World. France had already taken over the western half. That's why the western half of the island is in blue. And at this point, 1795, France, after winning this war against Spain, forces Spain to give up the rest of the island, basically. So after this year, 95, France is going to own all of Hispaniola. And France will force Spain into an alliance to fight off any future attempts by another coalition to invade France. This military debacle forces Spain to kind of join France at the hip, and that will continue causing major problems into the future. The biggest problem is that the British were just livid that Spain would sign a separate peace with France and get involved with the French alliance. So Britain was so angry at this, what they called the betrayal of the First Coalition, that Britain starts harassing Spanish ships out in the ocean, which it can get away with because it has the biggest navy in the world. And that eventually leads to a full-scale war in 1797 that'll go on for a couple of years. And again, the Spanish military suffers these gigantic defeats. And basically the Spanish Navy is really pretty much destroyed in a battle called the Battle of Cape St. Vincent off of the southwestern corner of Iberia. And the Spanish fleet, the Spanish Navy is so heavily destroyed that the British can start blockading the Spanish coastline. And they'll do that for a couple years, and that causes even bigger problems. So when the British start blockading, especially the giant city at Cadiz, this destroys the ability of the American colonies to trade with their home country, Spain. So the British blockades really stop about 99% of all the trade coming from the Latin American colonies. And Spain knows that those colonies need trade to survive because they're not making enough of their own goods to survive economically. So the Spanish government's solution is to allow neutral traders from other countries not involved in the war to go into the colonial ports in Latin America and start buying and selling and moving goods around. So this idea became known as neutral trade. And this becomes a giant problem for Spain because this opens up the floodgates to a lot of different countries going into the Spanish colonies. And even after the war ends in 1799, Spain can never get control back over their colonies' trade again. So there's going to be a ton of smuggling, a ton of all kinds of problems when Spain just suddenly opened the floodgates and allowed all other ships from all other countries to trade with its colonies. Even by the end of the war in 1799, 1798, the Spanish government is absolutely desperate for money to survive. So they came up with another plan to basically confiscate government property and even religious property, the Catholic Church's property, under a deal with whoever's giving land to the government. The government's going to sell these lands at auction to quickly raise money for the government. But the deal is that over a certain span of years, the government will repay the sale price to whoever they had gotten the land from in the first place, like the Catholic Church, plus a 3% kind of interest rate per year to the former landowner. So this raises a lot of immediate cash for the Spanish government through the auctions, but they have to start paying that out, and even paying more than they had got at first. So this actually does some damage to the Spanish economy, and especially the Spanish government's finances over the next few years. And there was some economic growth, though, in Spain, because now land is changing hands, their land prices are going up, so it does have some general economic benefits. And the government decided to apply this idea of the property auctions to the Latin American colonies in 1804, but it was a much different story result-wise in the colonies, because you have to remember the Catholic Church was a big lender to a lot of just Latin American people that need to borrow money. So when the Catholic Church starts getting involved in these auctions and kind of giving land to the government to sell, those sales basically forced a lot of people who had borrowed money from the Catholic Church to immediately pay it back in full, which of course they couldn't do, which led to a massive wave of bankruptcies and property loss throughout Latin America. So the property auctions became a disaster for Latin America, and was so problematic, along with these disastrous wars, that Godoy is forced out of office. He's forced to resign in 1798. And just after his resignation, a whole second coalition of largely many of the same powerful countries gets together in early 1799 to declare war against revolutionary France again. So the lineup of countries again is Britain, Austria, Russia, Portugal, the Ottoman Empire. They all declare war against France in 1799, again with the intention of invading France and destroying the revolution. And the French government at this point isn't running very well. So the most successful general within revolutionary France decides to take over the French government and make himself the leader of the French government. And this guy's name is Bonaparte. So Napoleon Bonaparte leads a coup against his own government. In December 1799, he basically takes the government leaders and throws them in jail, and basically takes over almost all the major powers of the government in the year 1800. He says in order to defend the revolution against all these foreign countries that are going to start invading, and to protect the revolution and guarantee all of its gains for the people. So the French Revolution's attack on monarchy in general and on the Catholic Church, on the official kind of Spanish religion, on the American colonies, because it seemed to question, if not completely remove, two of the biggest kind of pillars of colonial society, monarchy and the church. So this is what leads to a lot of instability, not just in Europe, but a lot of government and social instability in the colonies themselves. And then once the next revolution we're going to talk about next time, the revolution on Hispaniola, which will be basically a slave revolution to end slavery and create equality. That revolution will add a racial component to a lot of these debates that will impact a lot of the Latin American revolutions later on. So next time we're going to talk about the slave uprisings in Hispaniola. So we'll stop here for the day.